today's installment of Brief Conversations About Intergroup Relations. We have Thekla Morgenroth, Assistant Professor at Purdue University. Thekla, thank you for being here.
Of course, happy to be here.
And I did a great job with that pronunciation of your name.
You did. I'm
Thank
very
you.
proud of you.
We just rehearsed it, but that's all right. Okay, so I like to start these out very broad, even though we've talked about some of your work in class already. But what are the main questions that drive your research?
I mean, broadly, I would say I'm interested in how people think about social categories and hierarchies, and specifically kind of the cognitions and belief systems that kind of guide how people think, like which kinds of hierarchies and categorization systems they endorse, how they maintain those categorization and hierarchical systems, and what the outcomes of those systems are for our society, for kind of what policies people support, prejudice, stereotyping, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Very classic social psychologist answer. But so how does that lead you to this specific topic? The psychology of bodily autonomy and harm-based reasoning.
Yeah, so like I think this came from, so like a lot of my work focuses on gender and specifically kind of the gender sex binary and like how people like why people endorse these binary systems of gender and also how it is kind of maintained. And one of the ways in which it is maintained and is kind of like by treating men and women differently and kind of categorizing them as these different, vastly different social groups and reinforcing those ideas. And a lot of the research that has been done on that is kind of like a lot of it is like women in the workplace, like women and parenthood and stuff like that. But very little stuff has looked at. Um, I think like initially like this was informed by two things. One, that I feel like a lot of the psychology of gender is kind of the psychology of white women working in professional fields, and that feels kind of like frustrating to me. And the other part is kind of like, okay, like there's a lot of like stuff about jobs and not so much about like other ways in which like the gender hierarchy is maintained. And initially, this question of like this bodily autonomy paper was actually just driven. I was interested in how people think about sex work and kind of the decriminalization of sex work. So this was initially a much like narrower question. And then as I started looking into that, I was like, no, actually, one thing that I find really interesting is this bodily autonomy stuff and how people think about bodily autonomy differently for women and for men. And kind of what initially we were just interested in, okay, what are the arguments that people are generating? Or like why are they saying they're like opposed to giving women bodily autonomy or supportive of it? And then from that, then very quickly I was like, okay, everyone's talking about harm, but like I feel like this is like just a nice way to like it's just a nice way to like maybe post talk or like in a way to like not seem prejudicial or not sexist, kind of a way to just like argue these things. And so then we got into this whole thing of like, okay, what is the role of harm in kind of opposing bodily autonomy for women?
Okay, I mean that's a nice segue into some of the specific findings of your paper. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of these examples of harm-based arguments that you encountered really on both sides of the sex work debate, and off of that, why you think that these are so appealing to people intrinsically?
Yeah, of course. So like when we in our first study really just asked people, what do you think about the decriminalization of sex work? So sex work is illegal in most of the world, most of the United States, and even where it is legal, it is heavily regulated in a way that other service industries are not. And so we just we kind of talked to people about it, and we were like explained what the situation is, and we are like, okay, what do you think? Like, do you think this should be decriminalized or not, and why? And so a lot of the arguments in the of the people who are opposed to the decriminalization of sex work, they talk about harm. They say like, oh, this is like traumatizing for women. This might harm society. This might lead to the breakdown of marriages. This will like be like this exposes women to kind of psychological trauma, to harassment, to physical violence. All these arguments that aren't really based in reality. Like there's research showing that actually decriminalizing sex work makes it safer for sex workers. Um, and then the other arguments that kind of these opponents make are more about like kind of like purity stuff, like sort of like this is against the sanctity of marriage. Like sex should be between two married adults. This is not what God intended, like a lot of religious arguments. And then on the other side of the people who favor the decriminalization of sex work, they also often talk about harm. So they say like, oh, making it legal would make it safer for people. Women could report crimes that are being like if they're being harassed or kind of attacked, like they can report that to the police much more easily. It leads to higher use of condoms, so less spread of sexually transmitted diseases. So there's a lot of also like these like sort of harm-based arguments and saying that the decriminalization would reduce harm. And then there's a lot of arguments that are based on fairness. So kind of like this is like you're providing a service, you should be paid for that. That's how it works. Some people say like, oh, if men were the primary people doing like in this profession, then it would have been legalized long time ago. So it just seems like a lot of sort of fairness arguments. But what both of the camps have in common is they talk a lot about harm.
I see. So I think you have kind of some interesting methods in your paper about asking people to provide their explanations, just, tell me how you feel about this position and why, but also predicting their actual support for these issues by things like harm, fairness, and purity. And even though people are kind of drawn to harm explanations verbally, maybe it's more fairness and purity that's actually predicting how you're gonna feel and how strongly you're gonna feel about this position. So I wanna get at this disconnect a little bit. So what do you think it is where people are being drawn to these harm-based arguments? Are they kind of, is it, how conscious do you think it is? How effortful that they're knowingly drawing on a harm-based argument, or it's just something that kind of pops up as the most reasonable one to them?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have like exact data that like would tell us that. Like it could be both, like or one, like
Probably
sometimes one,
both,
sometimes
yeah.
the other. But there does seem to be like at least some it can at least be done in a conscious way. So, like, for example, in one of our papers, we specifically tell them select arguments that you think are convincing to either a political in-group. So, like, for Republicans, they would try to convince other Republicans, or like Democrats would convince other Democrats, versus try to convince a political outgroup member or like
Mhm.
to a group of political outgroup members. And when they're doing that, then they like kind of reduce like the relatively like they still like everyone likes harm arguments regardless. But like the relative, like how much they like those relative to or find them convincing relative to fairness and purity arguments really changes. So there seems to be at least some kind of conscious process that can affect to what extent people are drawing on like or are using fairness versus harm-based or purity versus harm-based arguments.
Changes in a way that harm is more prominent for an outgroup member. Is that right?
Yeah, so like
Okay.
exactly. So when they talk to in-group members, and it's unclear whether they think, oh, like the like based on like how we measured this and how we did this experiment, it's unclear whether they think like, oh, like harm is particularly or like purity is particularly not convincing to others, but more to in-group members. So like it seems to be like the movement goes um based on purity and fairness as well. So it's not just like harm is being changed, but it just overall it just seems like harm is like, okay, that's particular like way more than these other foundations or these other types of arguments is more convincing to outgroup members because harm is such a like basic moral violation. So everyone agrees that harm is bad, and
Mm.
so it makes sense that people would be like, okay, if harm is bad, I'm sure other people can agree on that. Whereas, like for example, a Christian who might want to make an argument about God and this is against the Bible will probably know that okay. This will not be super convincing to people who aren't Christians, who are not sharing my religious beliefs, but they probably still think harm is bad. So let me make these harm-based arguments.
I see. So because people probably think that harm is the most universally shared value, that people might pull off of that to try and convince others, even if that's probably might be less persuasive in the long run, because ultimately your thinking on this topic is not that driven by harm.
Yeah, but I think people don't know that. Like I think
Yeah, right.
they think it is like this convincing thing, but it isn't. Like I mean, we have two studies where we give people then harm-based arguments, and it like doesn't like all it does is basically then people are like, ah, harm doesn't matter so much to me
Okay, yeah, to
actually.
shift how much they actually say they value
Yeah,
harm.
yeah.
Looking big picture, it's a very nice set of studies you have here, but is there a particular direction that you would want to take this line of research next?
Yeah, I'm excited. So we're like currently starting a new or like have like data for one study and we're like doing more where we're like kind of looking at this. Um kind of in the context, I mean, not exactly these harm-based argument things, but like kind of like morality and bodies and autonomy, where we look at how that affects how people think about both male and female bodies. I guess presumed cisgender in this case, because that's what people think. Because we have this other paper that shows that one of the things that is driving this opposition to women's bodily autonomy is that women's bodies are moralized in a way that men's
Hmm.
bodies are not. And in this new set of studies, we're kind of looking at or planning to look at, okay, how does that affect um, both kind of bodily autonomy and bodily integrity for men and women? So bodily integrity refers to this thing of like what people can do to one's body. Like, is it okay to like harm up, like, for example, to give someone a vaccine that they don't want or something? And bodily autonomy is like, do we let people do what they want with their bodies, like for them to have agency? And we're kind of arguing that this moralization of women's bodies both leads to restrictions on women's bodily autonomy, but also limitations to men's bodily integrity, that people think like it's more okay for example, a man to be slapped during an argument, or a man to be drafted into the military, or a man to be sentenced to death. So there's some of these
Oh,
examples
okay.
that we see in real life where that seems to be the case, but it hasn't really been looked at like in experimental designs. And so we're kind of interested in expanding that, and also looking at how do people think about bodily autonomy for trans people, for non-binary
Hmm.
people. So that's another context that I'm interested in with this bodily autonomy stuff.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that ties back nicely into what you were saying earlier about expanding the way that we study gender, the psychology of gender. I'm no expert,
Mhm.
but I think you're right. You know, a lot of the classic work is just stereotypes of women in the workplace, but one could argue gender touches on pretty much everything in our lives. And so you're expanding that nicely here with this idea of men and body integrity. So you'll have to come back later and tell us all about it. Um, More broadly, even more broadly, zooming back farther. Is there a specific topic or issue that not you yourself per se, but you want intergroup relations to touch on in the years to come?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, many things, I guess. I think
Mhm.
like one thing that I like would hope for is that like intergroup relations literature um moves like it like starts to acknowledge the complexities of social groups more, and both in terms of like intersectionality stuff, studying more populations that haven't been studied as much, but also like sort of the heterogeneity of like how people even think about race or gender, or like any other sort of intergroup contexts. I do think that like of course cultures create these have like there's a shared understanding of what these groups mean, but I think there's actually also a lot of between person variation in how people actually think about these categories. And it's not like there's none of that work. Like obviously
Sure.
people study this stuff, but I feel like it would be cool to see more of that, and like that integrated into
Right.
more of the intergroup relations
Right.
work.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. You know, psychologists kind of impose this is what we mean by gender when we're studying these topics, and oftentimes that can be necessary to even start running some of these studies. But at the same time, what you're saying, it's assuming that everyone has the same conception of gender, even within a culture. But obviously, that's not the case. So to get a greater taxonomy of how even people approach this question makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I really do appreciate your time, Tekla, and thank you for telling us more about your research.
Of course. Thank you for having me.